What if the greatest army in the galaxy could be defeated by a folded piece of paper? That is exactly what the Valari Dominion never understood. For 100 years, the most feared empire in known space believed it had done something no other force in 6,000 years of conquest had managed. It believed it had broken humanity completely. No resistance, no sabotage, no whispers of rebellion. Just quiet, obedient silence stretching across an entire planet. But silence, as the Valari were about to learn, can be the loudest weapon of all. Earth in the year 2126 looked peaceful from orbit. Cities glowed in orderly grids. Streets were clean, crime was low, and citizens moved through their daily routines with practiced calm. Valari patrol ships drifted lazily above the clouds, their sensors sweeping for weapons, for gatherings, for anything resembling a threat. They found nothing. They had found nothing for decades. And that, more than any uprising ever could have, was exactly the point. Beneath that surface calm, a war had never stopped. It had only changed shape. Devin Cho stood in the dim light of a converted subway maintenance tunnel 3 stories beneath the ruins of Old Seoul, studying a wall covered with what looked like nothing more than laundry lists and grocery notes. To any Valari scanner, it was meaningless clutter, carbon-based scribbles, irrelevant, unworthy of translation. To Cho, it was a living map of the most patient rebellion ever built. Every symbol represented a courier, a safe house, a whispered signal passed hand to hand across a continent the invaders thought they fully controlled. Cho was 58 years old, though the Dominion's official records listed him as deceased 3 times, in 3 separate decades, in 3 separate purges of Valari were certain had eliminated the last embers of human defiance. Each time, he had simply vanished back into the crowd of ordinary faces the aliens had long since stopped bothering to watch. That was the first turning point the invaders never saw coming. The moment they decided ordinary people weren't worth watching was the moment they lost a war they thought they'd already won. The second turning point arrived that same night, in the form of a 9-year-old girl named Priya, who slipped through a checkpoint with a hollowed-out crayon box balanced casually against her hip. Inside its false bottom lay 3 strips of rice paper covering a code that resembled nothing but child's handwriting practice. A Valari sentry glanced at her, scanned the box out of routine boredom, and waved her through without a second thought. Machines built to detect weapons in rebellion had no protocol for detecting hope carried by a child humming a nursery rhyme. It was Mara Oae, however, who would soon hand the resistance something far more dangerous than any smuggled message. Mara worked the water reclamation stations beneath the Dominion's central occupation tower, one of the few infrastructure roles the Valari still trusted to human hands, since water management required no access to weapons, communications, or command systems. Or, so the Valari believed. For 6 years, Mara had quietly mapped every pipe, valve, and sensor conduit running beneath that tower. She had noticed something the engineers who built the Valari surveillance grid never anticipated. The cooling systems for their orbital sensor relays shared a maintenance corridor with the water network, a corridor with exactly 1 4-hour window each lunar cycle, when both systems required simultaneous manual recalibration. A blind spot, not created by sabotage, created by the invaders' own design, hidden in plain sight for a century. That night, Mara finally brought her findings to Cho. She spread a hand-drawn schematic across the tunnel table, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear of the Valari, but from the weight of what she was about to say. For hours, she whispered, every lunar cycle, for 4 hours, their orbital eyes go dark over the northern hemisphere. It's always been there. We just never had a reason to look. Cho stared at the diagram for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes, the look of a man who had waited decades for exactly this piece of information. This was the third turning point, the one that would set everything else in motion. A single blind spot, a single window, enough time, if used correctly, to do something no human had attempted in 100 years of occupation. Reach beyond Earth itself. We're not just planning a rebellion anymore, Cho said quietly, folding the schematic and tucking it inside his jacket. We're planning a message, one that needs to travel a lot farther than anyone in this room. Above them, unaware, Valari patrol ships continued their lazy orbit, confident in a peace built in the last century in the making. They had no idea that somewhere beneath their feet, Ordinary people were about to turn silence into the opening move of the largest uprising the galaxy had never seen. How do you build an army the enemy can't see, hear, or even imagine exists? You don't build an army at all. You build a language. In the centuries since the Valari Dominion silenced Earth's governments and dismantled its militaries, humanity had learned a truth that no occupying force had ever accounted for. You cannot arrest a nursery rhyme. You cannot interrogate a chalk mark on a sidewalk. You cannot put a folded grocery list on trial. The resistance Devon Cho commanded had no headquarters, no uniforms, and no chain of command that could be traced on any surveillance chart, because it wasn't built like an army. It was built like a language, spoken fluently by millions of people who had no idea they were even speaking it. A mother tied her child's shoelace in a specific double loop pattern near a checkpoint told nearby watchers that the route was clear. A street vendor arranging fruit in a particular pyramid shape signaled that a safe house had been compromised. Children playing hopscotch traced patterns that, to the trained eye, marked which buildings held listening devices and which held nothing at all. The Valari had scanned every wall, every wire, every digital signal on the planet. They had never once thought to translate a game. But even the most beautiful silence has cracks, and the first turning point of that long, careful winter came from inside the resistance itself. A courier named Theo Vance, only 23, had been recruited 2 years earlier after losing his sister in a Valari labor camp. He was eager, loyal, and reckless in exactly the way that made veteran resistance members nervous. When Valari internal security officers detained him during a routine sweep, not for suspicion of rebellion, but simply for being in the wrong district after curfew, Panic did what patience never would have. Under pressure and fear, Theo let slip a phrase to a fellow detainee that was not meant to leave resistance circles, a phrase referencing the Paper River, the internal name for their message network. The detainee, it turned out, was a Valari recruited informant, a human working for the occupiers in exchange for protection and privilege. Within hours, word reached Cho that the phrase had been repeated to Dominion officers, who filed it away as meaningless slang, unaware it was a thread that could unravel everything. The Resistance's carefully built invisibility had nearly been shattered by a single moment of fear, and for the first time in years, Cho was forced to consider a devastating truth. It wasn't Valari technology that threatened them most. It was human fragility under pressure. Cho's response became the second major turning point. Rather than punishing Theo or retreating into paranoid silence, Cho did something the Valari, obsessed with hierarchy and control, could never have predicted. He restructured the entire network into what became known as a scattering. Thousands of independent cells, each holding only enough information to complete their own small task, with no cell knowing the identity or location of more than 2 others. If one thread was pulled, nothing but that single thread would ever unravel. Theo's mistake, instead of destroying the resistance, forced it to evolve into something far more resilient than before, a lesson of Valari's own rigid command structure could never teach them. The third turning point came weeks later, when the newly scattered network faced its first true test, a coordinated action across 12 cities, executed entirely through paper notes, hand signals, and rehearsed public routines, with no digital communication whatsoever. The goal was modest by military standards: synchronized power flickers in 12 Valari administrative buildings, lasting only 90 seconds each, designed to test whether thousands of disconnected humans could act as one unified force without ever speaking to each other directly. At precisely 9:47 p.m. local time in every city, the lights flickered. All 12 buildings, all at once, exactly as planned. Valari technicians dismissed it as a power grid anomaly. Engineers filed maintenance reports. No alarms were raised, no investigations launched. But in that ordinary, forgettable moment, Cho and every cell leader across the planet understood something the Dominion did not. The network worked. Silence had a rhythm now, a heartbeat, and it could move in perfect unison across an entire world without ever being heard. Yet far above Earth, in the gleaming command spire that overlooked the ruins of Old Geneva, a Valari overseer named Braxis To reviewed a routine report and paused. 12 buildings. Same night, same 90-second duration. Coincidence, his instincts told him, was not a word the Dominion's 6,000-year history had much patience for. He filed a single note for further observation, the very first crack, however small, in 100 years of perfect confidence. The Volari did not yet know they were losing, but somewhere in that quiet report, they had just stopped being certain they were winning. What does it take to blind an empire, even for a single afternoon? Years of patience, a century of silence, and one impossibly narrow window that would never come twice. In the months following the 12-city test, Devon Cho's scattered network grew more disciplined, more confident, and more dangerous. Though dangerous was a word no Volari censor could have applied to grocery lists and chalk drawings. The resistance had proven it could move as one. Now came the far harder question. What exactly should it move toward? Mara Oa's discovery of the 4-hour blind spot in the orbital sensor relay had sat inside Cho's mind for months, turning over and over like a puzzle piece waiting for its picture. A single window, once every lunar cycle, when the Dominion's eyes over the northern hemisphere would go dark. It was tempting to imagine grand things. Armed uprising, seized weapons caches, a storming of the command spire itself. But Cho had lived through enough failed rebellions in his youth to know that the Volari's true strength was not their weapons. It was their absolute monopoly on information. No enslaved world in 6,000 years of Dominion conquest had ever known whether other worlds shared its chains. Total isolation, planet by planet, was the real prison. So the plan that took shape in that underground tunnel was not a battle. It was a message, one built to travel farther than any human voice ever had. The first turning point came when Mara returned to the tunnel with devastating news of her own. The 4-hour blind spot, she explained, wasn't purely mechanical. It required a live technician to manually override 2 separate recalibration locks, one in the water facility and one embedded 3 levels deeper inside restricted Volari infrastructure that no human had accessed in decades. Someone would have walked directly into the most heavily monitored section of the occupation tower, in person, and manipulate systems no unauthorized human was permitted to touch. It has to be someone with clearance, Mara said, her voice tight. And after this, they can never come back out the way they came in. The room fell silent. Volunteering for that task meant almost certain capture, or worse. The moment the mission was discovered, Cho watched the faces around him, waiting to see who would step forward, half expecting no one would. Mara did. It was her network, her decade of quiet mapping, her risk to take. She argued. Cho refused at first. Losing her would mean losing the only mind that fully understood the blind spot's mechanics. But Mara's argument won out for a simple, unshakable reason. She was the only person alive who could complete the override correctly on the first attempt, and there would be no second attempt. The Volari would notice a failed override far faster than a successful one. The second turning point arrived just 2 weeks before the planned window, when a routine security sweep very nearly derailed everything. Volari internal auditors, still quietly rattled by Overseer Brax's Toll's unresolved suspicions from the 12-city incident, ordered an unscheduled inspection of water facility personnel records. For 3 unbearable days, Mara's access credentials sat inside a review queue, one signature away from being flagged and revoked. Cho's network held its breath. If Mara lost clearance now, the entire plan collapsed before it began. It was Theo Vance, the same young courier whose earlier mistake had nearly unraveled the resistance, who quietly resolved the crisis. Using the scattered network's now refined methods, he arranged for a low-level Volari records clerk, unknowingly manipulated through months of carefully planted trust, to misfile Mara's review under an unrelated department. The flag disappeared into bureaucratic static. Mara's clearance remained intact. It was, in its own way, redemption. Proof that even a network built on scattered anonymity could still catch each other when someone began to fall. The third and final turning point came the night before the mission, when Cho gathered a small circle of people who knew the full scope of the plan. No more than 6 humans on the entire planet understood every piece of what was about to happen. Among them was a name few in the tunnel recognized. Alia Bren, a woman who had spent 4 years working as cargo staff aboard a Volari transport vessel, quietly cultivating the trust of officers who saw her as nothing more than efficient, invisible labor. She would be the final piece of the plan, the the one who would carry humanity's message not just past Earth's atmosphere, but into the Dominion's own communication network, riding alongside cargo manifests no one would ever think to inspect. Cho looked around the room at the 6 faces lit by a single lantern, each of them fully aware that within days, some or all of them might never be seen again. Tomorrow, for 4 hours, they go blind, he said quietly. What we do with that darkness is going to decide whether this planet stays a secret the galaxy never hears from, or becomes a reason 100 worlds finally look up. No one spoke. There was nothing left to plan. There was only the waiting, and the window that was finally, after 100 years, about to open. What would you risk if you knew the entire galaxy was listening, but only for 4 hours? The lunar cycle arrived on a gray, unremarkable morning that looked exactly like every other day of the occupation. That, Cho knew, was precisely how it needed to look. At 2:14 p.m., deep inside the restricted maintenance corridor beneath the Valari occupation tower, Mara Oe walked past 2 security checkpoints, using nothing but her water facility credentials and a decade of careful, boring reliability. Guards who had waved her through 1,000 uneventful shifts waved her through once more. She carried nothing suspicious. No weapons, no devices, nothing a scanner could flag. Only knowledge, memorized so thoroughly it no longer needed to exist on paper at all. At 2:41 p.m., she reached the first recalibration lock. This was the first turning point of the mission, and it nearly ended before it truly began. The override sequence Mara had studied for months required precise manual timing, synchronized with the water system's own automated cycle. A 30-second miscalculation in either direction would trigger an automatic alert. As her hands moved across the unfamiliar panel, a maintenance drone she hadn't accounted for drifted into the corridor on a routine patrol loop, its sensors sweeping directly toward her position. Mara didn't run. Running would have ended everything instantly. Instead, she knelt beside an open-access panel, feigning a routine repair, and waited as the drone scanner passed over her without pausing, programmed to look for weapons and unauthorized devices. Not a human calmly doing exactly the kind of unglamorous labor the Valari had always trusted her to do. The drone continued on. Mara exhaled and finished the override with 4 seconds to spare. At 2:58 p.m., 3 levels below, the second lock disengaged. Across the northern hemisphere, without a single alarm, the Dominion's orbital sensor relay quietly slipped into its blind window. For 4 hours, Earth had no eyes watching it from above. The second turning point unfolded far above the planet's surface, aboard a Valari cargo vessel drifting through a routine supply route between occupied systems. Alia Bren moved through the ship's lower cargo hold with the same practiced invisibility she had cultivated for 4 patient years, carrying a manifest tablet loaded with nothing more suspicious than inventory logs. Hidden within the tablet's data structure, however, was something the Valari's own communication protocols had never been designed to detect. A message compressed and disguised as a corrupted shipping error. The kind of harmless technical noise every long-haul vessel generated by the thousands. The message itself was brief. It contained no boasts, no declarations of rebellion, no demands. It simply stated, in a data format borrowed from decades of studying Valari communication leaks, 3 essential facts: that a species called humanity had survived a century of total occupation without surrendering its will, that a structural blind spot existed within the Dominion surveillance architecture, exploitable under specific conditions, and that Earth was reaching out, for the first time in 100 years, to ask a single question of anyone listening across the stars. Are you still there, and are you still fighting? Alia routed the message through a standard intership relay burst, timed precisely to Earth's 4-hour blind window, when Dominion security monitoring across the sector would be at its statistically lowest staffing rotation. It slipped into the vast, indifferent river of routine Dominion data traffic and vanished from her tablet forever. There was no way to know, in that moment, whether it would ever reach anyone at all. The third turning point came with less than 11 minutes remaining in the blind window, back inside the tunnels beneath Old Seoul. Devon Cho stood before a small gathered circle of resistance leaders as encrypted by obscurity paper reports flooded in from across the planet. 12 cities, then 30, then over 100, each confirming the same extraordinary fact. For 4 uninterrupted hours, hidden transmitters had activated undetected. Secret documents had changed hands in the open, and entire caches of resistance intelligence had moved across continents without a single Volari flag being raised. Then, at 6:58 p.m., with 2 minutes remaining, Mara OA's final message reached the tunnel through 3 relay couriers. Override complete, exit successful, no alarms triggered. The relief in that underground room was immediate, but Cho did not allow himself to celebrate. He understood, better than anyone present, that the mission's true success would not be measured in the next 4 hours, or even the next 4 days. It would be measured in silence, in whether, somewhere out among 100 enslaved worlds of Dominion had conquered over 6,000 years, a message written by hidden hands on a planet called Earth found someone willing at last to answer back. At 7 p.m. exactly, the Volari orbital relay flickered back to life above the northern hemisphere, exactly on schedule, exactly as it had every lunar cycle for 100 years. No alarm sounded, no investigations launched. To every Volari officer monitoring routine systems that evening, absolutely nothing had happened at all. They had no idea that somewhere in the vast dark between stars, a message was already traveling, carrying humanity's quiet, impossible question out into a galaxy that had forgotten what defiance sounded like. What happens when a message written in secret finally finds someone willing to answer? Silence. Devon Cho had come to understand over 3 decades of resistance was rarely empty. It was simply waiting to be filled by the right sound. For 6 weeks after the 4-hour blackout, that silence held. No confirmation, no response, no sign that Alia Bren's hidden message had reached anyone beyond the endless churn of Dominion cargo traffic. The tunnel beneath Old Soul grew tense with a particular kind of exhaustion. The fear that everything risked, Mara's exposure, Theo's redemption, Alia's 4 years of careful patience, might have simply dissolved into the void, unheard. Then, on the 43rd day, the first turning point arrived, carried not by triumphant fanfare, but by the same unremarkable cargo manifest static the original message had used to disguise itself. Alia, still embedded aboard her transport vessel, noticed an anomaly buried within a routine shipping error report, a corrupted data fragment that, when decoded through the same makeshift protocol resistance had built, resolved into 3 words: "We are not alone." The message had come from a world the Dominion cataloged only as Designation Kethra 9, a mining colony conquered nearly 400 years earlier, so thoroughly subdued that Volari Command considered it among the most compliant territories in the Empire. For 4 centuries, the people of Kethra 9 had believed themselves entirely, permanently alone, the last ember of resistance among their people extinguished generations before any of them had been born. Humanity's fragmented, disguised transmission had reached them not as a call to immediate arms, but as something far more dangerous to the Dominion's control. Proof. Proof that occupation, no matter how total, no matter how many centuries endured, had never actually been permanent anywhere. Alia relayed the confirmation back to Earth through the same painstaking, invisible channels, and when the 3 words finally reached Cho's tunnel, the underground room that had spent 6 weeks holding its breath erupted into something the Resistance had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope, unguarded and real. The second turning point unfolded far more slowly. Over the following months, as the effects of that single reply began rippling outward in ways even Cho hadn't fully anticipated, Kethra 9, once it understood it was not alone, began quietly testing the same techniques Earth had spent a century perfecting. Hidden signals, disguised communication, patient invisible networks built from ordinary daily life rather than weapons. And Kethra 9's own careful outreach, once established, began reaching still other worlds along Dominion trade routes. Each new contact passing the same essential truth forward like a flame carried hand to hand through darkness. You are not the only one still resisting. Within 8 months, faint, disguised signals of coordinated activity had been detected, though not yet understood, on no fewer than 11 occupied worlds across 3 separate sectors of Dominion space. None of it resembled rebellion by any definition the Volari's 6,000-year history had trained them to recognize. There were no weapon stockpiles, no military buildups, no communications the Dominion's translation algorithms flagged as threatening. Just small, scattered irregularities, minor power fluctuations, unexplained cargo discrepancies, patterns in local behavior that made no logical sense by Valari standards, because they weren't meant to be understood by machines built to detect violence. They were built from something the Dominion had never needed to defend against before: the ordinary resilience of enslaved people quietly refusing, in 100 small invisible ways, to stop being who they were. The third turning point arrived in the gleaming command spire above Old Geneva, where Overseer Braxis Tull, still haunted by his unresolved suspicions from the 12-city incident more than a year earlier, finally received something he'd been waiting for without fully realizing it: a cross-sector anomaly report, compiled almost by accident by a junior data analyst comparing irregular activity logs across multiple occupied systems. The report noted in flat bureaucratic language that behavioral irregularities on Earth bore statistically significant resemblance to newly emerging irregularities on Kethrin 9 and at least 2 other worlds, despite those systems having no known communication pathway between them. Braxis Tull read the report twice, then a third time, his forefinger hand resting motionless against the cold surface of his desk. In 6,000 years of Dominion conquest, no occupied world had ever independently influenced another. Isolation was not merely a policy of the Valari Empire. It was a foundational law upon which the entire structure of their eternal rule had been built. If that law had been broken, even in some small, disguised, barely measurable way, then everything the Dominion believed about the permanence of its own power required urgent, immediate re-examination. He did not yet understand what he was looking at. He did not yet have a name for it, a shape, a source he could point to and eliminate. But for the first time in a century of watching Earth's perfect, obedient silence, Braxis Tull felt something the Valari's ancient, unshakable confidence had never prepared him to feel: doubt. What happens when an empire finally realizes the war it thought it won 100 years ago never actually ended? Overseer Braxis Tull's doubt did not remain quiet for long. Within weeks, that single anomaly report had climbed through layer after layer of Dominion command, arriving eventually at the desk of High Regent Sylvain Kale, one of only 9 individuals in the entire empire authorized to make decisions affecting occupied world policy across all sectors simultaneously. What the High Regent found waiting was not a rebellion any military doctrine could easily counter. It was something far stranger and, in its own way, far more alarming: evidence that ordinary, unarmed, thoroughly monitored civilians across multiple unconnected worlds had somehow begun behaving as though they shared knowledge they should never have been able to share. The first turning point of the Dominion's response came swiftly and predictably: a crackdown, ordered across Earth and its newly suspected sister worlds, unlike anything the planet had experienced in decades. Surveillance quotas tripled, curfews tightened, random searches, long abandoned as unnecessary in a population of Valaria considered permanently pacified, resumed with aggressive new intensity. For the resistance beneath Old Sol, it was the most dangerous stretch since the occupation's earliest years. But Cho's network had spent a century learning precisely the wrong lesson, from the Dominion's perspective, about what crackdowns actually accomplish. Every additional Valari patrol pattern became new information the scattered cells absorbed and mapped. Every expanded search protocol revealed new gaps its architects hadn't anticipated. Every increase in pressure, rather than crushing an invisible network, taught it more about the shape of the enemy pressing down on it. Theo Vance, older now and far more careful than the reckless young courier who had once nearly exposed everything, began compiling Crackdown's patterns into what would become the Resistance's most valuable resource yet: a living map of exactly how the Dominion behaved when frightened. The second turning point arrived when Kethra 9, emboldened rather than deterred by increased Dominion suspicion across the sector, executed its own version of Earth's blind window strategy. Smaller in scale, cruder in execution, but successful enough to send a second disguised transmission rippling outward to yet more worlds. Within Dominion Command, reports of similar low-level irregularities began arriving from systems that had never once appeared on any watch list in the Empire's 6,000-year history. What had begun as one planet's century of patient defiance was no longer isolated to Earth at all. It had become a method, a replicable, adaptable model of resistance that required no weapons, no armies, and no centralized leadership the Dominion could locate and eliminate. High Regent Sylvain Kale convened an emergency council session, and it was there that the third and most devastating turning point occurred, not on Earth, not aboard any resistance-held tunnel, but inside the heart of Dominion power itself. A senior intelligence officer, presenting findings a council had demanded in growing desperation, delivered a single sentence that would echo through Volari command for years afterward. The Empire was not facing a rebellion it needed to locate and destroy. It was facing an idea it could not locate at all, because that idea lived inside the ordinary daily behavior the very populations of Dominion had spent millennia teaching itself to overlook. The council chamber fell into a silence Volari officials, accustomed to 6,000 years of uninterrupted dominance, had rarely experienced. There was no obvious target, no headquarters to bomb, no leader to capture, no army to defeat in open battle. Just a slow, spreading realization that the most powerful empire in known space had built its entire strategy of control around the assumption that conquered people, once silenced, stayed silent forever. And that assumption, the very foundation of 6,000 years of unbroken rule, had just been proven catastrophically wrong. Beneath Old Soul, Devon Cho received word of the Dominion's internal panic through channels that had taken a century to build. And for the first time since Marway had first unrolled her water system schematic across that tunnel table, he allowed himself something he rarely permitted, a quiet, unguarded smile. "They still don't understand what they're looking at," he said to the small circle gathered around him. Faces that now included Mara, Theo, and Alia, each carrying scars and victories a Dominion would never fully comprehend. "They think this is a fire they can put out. It isn't a fire. It's a language. And you can't arrest a language once enough people are already speaking it." Above them, across 100 worlds of Volari Dominion had believed permanently silenced, that language continued spreading, hand to hand, whisper to whisper, chalk mark to chalk mark, carried by people the Empire had spent a century training itself never to watch. The Volari had finally noticed the crack spreading through their 6,000-year foundation. But noticing a crack and understanding how to stop it from becoming a fracture were two very different things. Somewhere among 100 newly whispering worlds, the pieces of the largest interstellar uprising in galactic history were already falling into place. And Earth, the planet the Dominion had once dismissed as fully, permanently conquered, stood quietly at its center. The real war was only just beginning.